They're the people you thought you knew and the people you want to know more about. The all-new Biography Channel. Step out of your life and into the lives of movie stars and moguls. From their most dramatic on-screen performances to the untold drama of their lives.
Every night, you could live another life.
Movies, biographies, and documentaries. 24 hours a day. The Biography Channel. Call your cable operator or satellite provider.
They strike without warning, bringing shock, horror, and death.
The reason that suicide bombers are so effective is because anybody can be a victim anywhere, anytime.
How can anyone bring themselves to this point, shattering the lives of innocents around them and guaranteeing their own death? And how can we prevent this horror coming much closer to home?
I think that we have to contemplate the possibility that suicide terrorism could come to these shores on a sustained basis.
Rush hour at Grand Central Terminal, New York. 500,000 people pass through this American landmark every day.
Grand Central Station is very vulnerable. And, 18 months after 9/11, we do not have metal detectors.
Despite having suffered the worst ever suicidal terrorist attack on U.S. soil on September 11, 2001, some of the nation's most famous and popular locations remain open to suicide bombers.
We do not have sufficient TV surveillance. We do not have explosive detectors.
At Grand Central, no one is searched as they enter. There is no screening for guns or explosives. Bags are not checked.
Well, a suicide bomber, that's Broadway, Times Square, Grand Central Station, they symbolize America. And the fact is that right now, although security's been improved, unless you wanted to shut them down, it would be very hard to protect them.
Terrorism experts are resigned to the inevitability of suicide bombers striking American targets.
I think for suicide terrorism to be effective, it has to be sustained. It can't be a 1 or a 2 or even a 3 off. It can't be a sporadic, random event.
Since September 11th, metal detectors have been erected at Times Square temporarily for New Year's Eve celebrations, but then removed. Subways, sidewalks, and shopping districts remain vulnerable to those prepared to turn their bodies into deadly weapons.
You've basically turned a human into the ultimate smart bomb, who can use disguise and deception to penetrate a target, who can get as close as possible to the target and therefore inflict the maximum damage.
The terrorist has complete control of the time, the place, and the moment when he detonates his bomb. If America wants to understand the nature of the threat posed by suicide bombers, it must look to its closest ally in the Middle East. America's historical support for Israel and President Bush's determination to oust Saddam Hussein from Iraq has infuriated and inflamed much of the Muslim world and made the United States a primary target for Islamic extremists prepared to die in order to kill.
You can't sit down with an Islamic fundamentalist and tell that Islamic fundamentalist that you're going to give them more territory, that you're going to give them more money, you're going to give them more jobs. What they want to do is eliminate you.
As recently as January 2003, the Palestinian terror group Hamas publicly called on the Iraqi people to become suicide bombers against American troops, calling America the Great Satan.
I think certainly the fears that have been expressed, terrorism coming to shopping malls, to restaurants, to public gathering places, even to the corner supermarket, can't be dismissed.
Since September 2000, Israel has been shaken to its core by a wave of suicide bombings carried out by Palestinian extremists. More than 300 Israeli men, women, and children have been killed, and thousands more wounded. The fear now is that this tactic may be copied by Islamic extremists who regard America as the real enemy.
I spent much of 2002, as the attacks became more frequent in Israel, wondering when it was going to happen in the United States. It came to seem like it was only a matter of time.
James Bennett is the New York Times correspondent in Jerusalem. He has reported from the scene of dozens of suicide bombings.
They blow themselves up on buses, in restaurants, on crowded streets. By the very nature, these attacks are completely random and seemingly utterly indifferent to who the victims are.
The bombers look for targets where they can guarantee the maximum number of casualties. A favorite target is a crowded bus.
Anybody who lives in Jerusalem lives in fear of these sorts of bombings, and I also live in Jerusalem. My family lives here, and it is a terrifying reality of life here.
These are extracts from propaganda videos the bombers make the night before they blow themselves up. They are videotaped by an accomplice, proudly announcing that they have become a shaheed, or living martyr.
The title living martyr psychologically means for them that they are already dead. They are walking dead.
Psychological autopsies carried out by talking to family members and friends of the bomber have not uncovered evidence of madness.
These were, as much as could be judged by the data, these were, well, normal people. None of them was psychotic. They did function in society. They went to school, they worked. Most came from middle class or lower middle class families. Education, very, very similar. I mean, these were not dumb, uneducated people.
But what drives a well-educated and apparently sane young Palestinian to destroy his and other lives so violently?
My experience as a reporter has led me to believe that there are a wide variety of motivations involved here, and possibly by understanding the phenomenon better, Israelis and particularly Palestinians may be able to do something to stop it.
19-year-old Dia Tawil was an accomplished student of electrical engineering. His sister Nida is a chemistry student who spent 3 years studying in Florida before returning to live with her family in the Palestinian city of Ramallah.
My brother was a very sweet, sensitive person. He's the sweetest person in my family.
But every day, Dia Tawil witnessed the impotence of his people and the overwhelming strength of the Israeli security forces.
He used to say that this doesn't work. The stone cannot stand in the front of a tank. I used to tell him, what can we do? You know, we have nothing to do. He would just smile.
On March 27, 2001, Dia Tawil strapped on a homemade bomb, walked to a bus at a Jewish settlement in northern Jerusalem, and detonated himself. The night before, he had vowed to turn his body and bones into shrapnel to kill the Zionist occupiers. More than 20 Israelis were badly injured. Dia died instantly.
I'm so proud of him. I'm proud of him. I'm proud he had the courage to do such a thing.
Dia Tawil was a devout Muslim, and religious fervor clearly plays a part in the choices made by other suicide bombers.
They love Allah and they love their own family and their own society, and they are doing it out of love and hope, which is so terrible and scary.
Yigal Carmen is a former counterterrorism advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister's office. He believes religious extremism is the key to understanding suicide bombers.
The only way through which you can take a human being and make him being able to die in this way, take his own life, is this mechanism which gives him eternal life in heaven, gives him the esteem of society, gives him the love of Allah, which is maybe the most important thing.
The Islamic extremists responsible for the attack on America on September 11, 2001 were men in their 20s and 30s. They were highly trained and had devoted years of secret preparation to their deadly task. By comparison, many of the Palestinian suicide bombers were barely out of their teens, young, impressionable adults.
You can't entirely separate this phenomenon from the difficulty of being an adolescent generally. All the sorts of things that can, in some cases, drive a young person anywhere to commit suicide. as an attention-getting device.
Palestinian teenagers come of age in one of the world's most bitterly divided and violent societies.
Now you overlay on top of that the religious element here and this supercharged political atmosphere.
Israeli intelligence says there are more Palestinian volunteers ready to become suicide bombers than there are bombs for them to use.
In some cases, suicide candidates actually agree on the order of carrying out this suicide mission. I'll be the first, you'll be the second, etc. This is a very powerful contract that one cannot break without losing any shred of self-respect and the respect of his friends.
Young Palestinians don't look up to movie stars or famous athletes. Their heroes are the shaheed, martyrs who have given their lives for the cause.
If someone comes along to you and says, you can be heroic by doing this, your life can have meaning, you could see people conduct these sorts of horrible suicide attacks.
And recently, the traditional ranks of suicide bombers have been swollen and distorted by the latest recruits, young women.
When an 18-year-old Palestinian girl is induced to blow herself up, and in the process kills a 17-year-old Israeli girl, the future itself is dying.
America is Israel's staunchest ally. American-made tanks and helicopters are used by the Israeli army to crush any sign of rebellion by Palestinians. But will America's unquestioning support for Israel make Americans targets for the suicide bombers?
I believe that everyone should remember that we are fighting here a war against terror as it was defined by the President of the United States.
Israeli politicians like Government Minister Ronnie Milo are anxious to link Palestinian suicide bombers with Islamic extremists targeting America.
This Islamic way of suicide bombers is a threat to the whole world. It's not only a threat to Israel. It's not related directly to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians.
The faces of dead suicide bombers stare down from the walls of every Palestinian town and village. To local children, these men are not evil, ruthless killers. They are heroic martyrs, or shaheed.
Nowadays, 4, 5, 6-year-old children, their favorite game is shaheed. One 5-year-old kid bursts into a group of other kids shouting, "I'm a shaheed!" Boom! And they all fall down. And it's a children's popular game.
The typical suicide bomber of the past was a young religious Palestinian man. But as the war between Israel and the Palestinians has become more bloody and bitter, new disturbing recruits have come forward. Ayat Akras was 18 and Palestinian. Rachel Levy was 17 and Israeli. The two could have been mistaken for sisters. They lived less than 15 miles apart, but the first time they met was the day they died. Ayat lived in the Disha refugee camp near Bethlehem. Rachel once visited Disha on a field trip from her Jerusalem school to find out why so many Palestinians seem to hate Israelis.
She used to say, "Why they hate me? I don't hate them. I want to help them. I want them to tell me what's the problem."
Rachel's mother, Abigail, says her daughter was shocked to learn how some Palestinians lived.
And she said that she felt very sorry for them and that they have hunger, that most of them are hungry, they don't have food, and that they live in camps, they don't have actually homes like we have.
Construction worker Mohammed Akras knew nothing of his daughter's plan to become a suicide bomber. He says he brought her up to respect other faiths and not to hate.
We are not terrorists. We don't want bloodshed. We love all mankind. We do not distinguish if someone is a Muslim, Christian, or a Jew.
Ayat was also surrounded with constant reminders of the violence that is part of life for both Israelis and Palestinians. Her father says she was particularly affected by the death of one neighbor at the hands of Israeli soldiers.
My daughter and her neighbor were like brother and sister. He got killed right in front of her eyes. How do you expect her to feel?
But despite the violence, Ayat Akras seemed intent on a normal life. She was a straight-A student, planning to study journalism after high school, and she was engaged to be married. Rachel Levy was also a good student and planned to be a designer. She liked to spend every Friday, the Jewish Sabbath, with her mother.
Friday is a special day because me and Rachel, was our day off from school and work, and we used to spend that day together, only two of us.
On March 29, 2002, Rachel Levy went shopping for her mother to buy spices for their regular Friday night special dinner. Friday is also a holy day for Muslims. 15 miles away that same afternoon, Ayat Akras was expected home from school.
We prepare food for the whole family and we all eat together. She was late.
But Ayat was not coming home. Without telling her family, she had decided to become a suicide bomber for the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. James Bennett has interviewed the man who drove Ayat Akras on her first and final mission.
He claims that on the way he tried to talk her out of the bombing, at least raise the idea that she didn't have to kill herself that day. She insisted she was ready to kill herself and carry out this attack. She said that she had eaten a very good meal and she was ready to die.
Ayat's chosen target was a Jerusalem supermarket used by mainly Jewish customers. Police Superintendent Gil Kleiman was one of the investigating officers.
Friday, people shopping for the Sabbath. It's a grocery store. People sell produce here and they sell canned goods and they have paper goods. There's no military target here whatsoever.
At 1:50 p.m., Ayat Akras walked to the front entrance of the supermarket.
There's a security guard standing at the entrance to the store. A woman suicide bomber tries to enter the store. According to what we know, one of the last words of the guard was, "I don't care if we blow up together, you're not entering into this store."
As Ayat started struggling with the security guard, Rachel Levy was standing behind her, waiting to enter the store.
She didn't realize what's going on. If I was there with her, I'm sure that my head will tell me that this is a suicide situation. I will push her out.
Unable to get past the security guard, Ayat Akras detonated herself in the entrance to the supermarket.
She blows herself up. With that, kills two people, the security guard and a young woman who had also come to shop, blown up and killed. We had over 27 people wounded.
Abigail Levy, waiting for her daughter to return with the ingredients for their dinner, was close enough to hear the sirens.
On that minute, I knew that something happened to my daughter.
15 miles away, Ayat Akras's father only knew that his daughter had not come home for the family meal.
Unfortunately, she was late, and then we heard about her incident on the television.
In this video recording, made the night before she died, Ayat said she was proud to die to avenge the death of other young Palestinians. Her father says he is proud of his daughter, but broken-hearted by her death.
It hurts, hurts in a horrible way. I can't even describe it. It's deep inside me. It's agony.
In the terrible confusion at the scene, police at first mistook Rachel Levy as the suicide bomber's accomplice.
They looked the same hair, dark skin, same age, small. She was petite, small one. Everything was the same. And he said that he was sure that she's a suicide bomber as well.
But after a desperate search through Jerusalem's busy hospitals, Abigail finally found her daughter.
And I saw Rachel. They didn't let me see her body, only her face. But I saw that she had, they put makeup on her face, I don't know why. And you can see on her face that her face stayed the same. Pretty girl. She got killed instantly. She didn't suffer.
no suicide bomber acts alone. The Israeli security forces say that behind every bomber there is a well-organized team, ready to recruit the next martyr.
There's someone there masterminding the operation, and there's someone preparing the suicide belt, sewing it up actually, and someone who puts in the explosives, and someone who drives the car which will take that suicide bomber to his target in the heart of Israel. So it's a whole operation, it's a network of people who are actively engaged in carrying out these suicide bombings.
When the current wave of suicide bombings began in September 2000, some of the worst attacks were perpetrated by members of the Islamic extremist movement, Hamas. Hamas leader Abdel Aziz Rantizi has vowed to continue suicide bombings until the Israelis leave every inch of Palestinian land.
Israel is attacking us all the time by heavy weapons like F-16 Apache tanks. We haven't heavy weapons. We haven't even the weapons to defend our people against the Israeli weapons. So we use our bodies to make them to feel our pain, our suffering.
Hamas say their suicide bombers try to avoid civilian casualties.
All the time our fighters targeting soldiers and settlers. By the way, some civilians may be killed, but believe me, all the time we are not targeting children, we are not targeting women.
However, the independent human rights organization Amnesty International has investigated suicide bombings by Hamas and concluded that they and other Palestinian terror organizations deliberately target civilians in what Amnesty International calls crimes against humanity. Given America's traditional support for Israel and the U.S. war on Islamic terror, will hardline Palestinian terror groups like Hamas send suicide bombers to the United States?
No, we said it many times before that we have just one enemy who occupied our lands, the Israelis. We will not attack or target Americans anywhere, despite their supporting to our enemy.
But just weeks after giving this interview, Mr. Rantizi told 3,000 supporters at a rally in support of Iraq that Iraqis should copy the tactics of his suicide bombers and use their bodies as weapons to destroy the American invaders.
The fact is that terrorists are terrorists. Terrorists work with each other. They support each other's causes. And just because Hamas says that they're not interested in America doesn't make me believe that that's true.
There is reason to fear that Islamic suicide bombers could bring their most terrible weapon to America's shores.
The problem with terrorists is that when they see something works in one country, they often export that strategy to other countries. So I think prudently one couldn't discount the possibility of suicide terrorism coming to the United States on a sustained basis.
It's not as if it hasn't happened before. On February 23, 1997, Ali Abu Kamal, a 69-year-old Palestinian, shot dead 2 people and injured 6 others before killing himself on the observation deck of the Empire State Building.
At the time, it was dismissed as the act of a lone individual or deranged, mentally unstable person. But this is part of the problem. He may not have belonged to an actual terrorist organization, but clearly there was a political dimension to it.
In July 1997, New York police officers arrested 2 Palestinians who were planning to plant bombs on the New York subway.
There's no question that part of the motivation here, or part of the intent here, was to attack the United States, to attack Israel, and to attack Jewish interests.
The police commissioner at the time was Howard Safer.
2 Palestinian young men on 4th Avenue in Brooklyn had put together 2 knapsack bombs that they were going to detonate on the subway in Brooklyn.
When the would-be bombers realized they were about to be arrested, they showed they were willing to die in order to kill.
And as they went through the door on 4th Avenue, one of the young men jumped to this knapsack which had 3 switches, flipped 2 switches before he was shot, and it was a fully active bomb with about 7-inch nails in it, and it would have probably killed 60 to 100 people.
At their trial, the bombers admitted that they viewed Israelis and Americans as interchangeable targets.
They were Palestinian. They believed that killing Jews was something that they were required and needed to do. It was very illustrative of the fact that we're very vulnerable in that way.
Israeli citizens know that despite all their defenses, they remain vulnerable to the suicide bombers.
The street is strewn with debris. There were backpacks and some notebooks belonging to children heading to school.
Our cameras captured the appalling aftermath of a typical bus bombing. The bomber had been wearing a belt loaded with explosives and packed with nails, screws, and bolts to act as shrapnel. Body parts had to be collected in garbage bags. 10 people died instantly, 6 women and 4 children. Gil Kleiman was born in the U.S. and brought up in Brooklyn, but he's been with the Israeli police force for 20 years.
What we know is a Palestinian male from Bethlehem got on the bus a number of stops before where the explosion occurred, worked his way towards the middle of the bus, crowded bus, people go to school, people go to work, explodes himself while he's in the middle of the bus. As a result of that, we have 10 dead and over 30 wounded.
The Palestinian organizations controlling the suicide bombers claim they attack Israeli military targets and try to avoid civilian casualties.
I don't know how anybody can consider a bus with children going to school and people going to work a military target. This is beyond my comprehension.
The seriously wounded are rushed to Hadassah Hospital, which has treated more than 2,000 victims of suicide bombings in less than 2 years. Hospital spokeswoman Barbara Sofer has just learned that another casualty has died, bringing the death toll to 11, and that many of the wounded are children.
How can one have any fabric of trust with people who sit out in the morning and think, how many Jewish kids can we kill today?
Barbara Sofer doesn't accept the argument that suicide bombings are the product of Palestinian desperation in the face of Israeli repression.
I don't care how desperate you are. I'm sick and tired of the baby crying desperation. I feel today this is another ugly blow at the Jewish people and the state of Israel. This isn't about anything but that.
But while the physical evidence of the attack can soon be removed, the aftershock of the wave of suicide bombings that has rocked Israel reverberates around the world.
Suicide terrorism, I think, has always been perhaps the most potent psychological weapon in the terrorist arsenal. And it has a psychological impact that's almost disproportionate to the carnage that it does genuinely inflict.
The roots of suicide bombing in the Middle East can be traced back 20 years to what is still the worst attack on an American target overseas, the U.S. Marine base in Beirut in 1983. A Muslim extremist drove a truck packed with explosives through the gates of the Marine base before detonating his deadly cargo.
241 Marines were killed. 2 months later, there was an attack against the U.S. Embassy in Kuwait. So just within the span of 1983, suicide terrorism had really taken hold, especially suicide bombings, as a special weapon in the terrorist arsenal.
The immediate American response to the suicide attack was to withdraw the Marines from Lebanon. The unmistakable message to the Muslim world was that suicide bombing works.
If you're an organization that is offering up your fighters to make the ultimate sacrifice, how can people not rally to your cause?
1.8 million Palestinians live on land they cannot call their own. According to the United Nations, nearly 50% survive on less than $2 a day. Nearly 25% of Palestinian children are malnourished. It makes for a fertile recruiting ground for the next generation of suicide bombers.
Suicide bombers are not born, they are made. And if we want to solve this issue, we have to deal with the causes.
A few prominent Palestinian politicians have spoken out against suicide bomb attacks.
It's morally repugnant to destroy civilians for whatever reason.
But even moderate Palestinians say they can understand the motivations of the suicide bombers.
The fact is, you need to provide them with an alternative, with hope, with a clear plan, with a clear vision of an end. But if you continue to allow the Palestinians to be captive of their desperation and pain, then they will lash out and they will react.
And some Palestinian children, growing up surrounded by fear, deprivation, and hate, have already decided that when their time comes, they will lash out.
I want to learn how to make bombs, and I want to blow up the Israelis the way they blow us up.
cycle of violence between Israelis and Palestinians now seems unbreakable. Each Palestinian suicide bombing prompts an instant and massive Israeli military response. And while Israel has been condemned internationally for excessive use of force, it sees itself as standing side by side with America in the war on terror.
Whether it's in the 11th September in New York or in Washington, Israel is a part of the war against terror. We are fighting against terror. We are the front line of this war against terror.
Virtually every Palestinian town and village is surrounded by a ring of Israeli steel. Everyone going in or out has to pass through intense and sometimes heavy-handed security.
Israelis in general many of them are quite aware that there's a risk that they'll contribute to greater hatred through some of these measures. In the course of trying to identify a few people who do carry out these attacks, they wind up inevitably punishing an entire population.
In one of the most damaging blows to the international reputation of Israel, Mohammed al-Dura, an innocent 12-year-old Palestinian boy out shopping with his father, was shot and killed during a gun battle on the streets of Gaza in October 2000. The Israeli government strongly denies ever deliberately targeting Palestinian civilians.
I don't think that we attacked ever young children intentionally. Sometimes young child is killed when there is such an attack and he is also a victim of it. But they attack intentionally young children. Our soldiers never attack young children intentionally, never.
Israelis certainly say that the difference between them and Palestinian terrorist organizations is that they don't intend to kill civilians, that it happens accidentally, and Israelis express regret for that. It's a distinction that's generally lost on the Palestinians. All they know is that their children have been shot dead, and it causes a great deal of outrage as a result.
The Israeli army says any civilian casualties are because Palestinian terrorists hide among the general population.
People must understand that this isn't something which will not go away unless someone is willing to fight these terrorists. And I always say it's like mowing the lawn. And when you mow the lawn, then it's short for a while. But if you don't tend to your garden, it's going to grow wild.
Tending the garden has involved the death of nearly 2,000 Palestinians at the hands of the Israeli army. This death toll includes nearly 400 children. 9-year-old Sahib Kabaha and his brother Watan, age 7, live near the Palestinian refugee camp of Jenin. Their father was a senior officer in the Palestinian security forces. His family claim he was captured, blindfolded, and then killed by Israeli soldiers.
He was executed, 2 shots, one here and one here.
The Israeli army denies any role in the killing. It has left the 2 boys bitter and vowing to become suicide bombers, or shaheed, to hit back at Israel.
I'd like to become a chemical engineer and specialize in explosives. We want our freedom, and we want to die as martyrs. I want to tell the Israelis that people are blowing themselves up because the Israelis are destroying Palestine.
And while Palestinian children vow to avenge the death of their parents, Israeli children continue to die at the hands of the suicide bombers. Smadar Elhanan was 14 when she was killed by a suicide bomber.
She was one of a kind. Every father will tell you. She was very full of life, laughing all the time, brilliant student, dancer, beautiful girl.
On September 4th, 1997, Smadar went shopping with 2 friends in busy downtown Jerusalem. At 3:10 p.m., 3 young Palestinian men detonated bombs, killing themselves and 4 Israeli shoppers. Smadar was killed instantly.
And when you go down to the morgue, this moment your life turns around. You're not the same person anymore. Everything has changed.
But although Remy Elhanan lost his beloved daughter, he has shocked Israeli public opinion by saying he understands the motives of the suicide bomber and sees no difference between the killing of his daughter and the deaths of Palestinian civilians at the hands of Israeli troops.
The most horrible thing in the world is killing innocent people. It's unforgivable. You cannot forget it, you cannot tolerate it. And it doesn't matter if you kill an innocent people in the street in a suicide bombing, or you put a 1-ton bomb on a house without checking who is inside.
Faced with a seemingly endless onslaught of suicide bombers, some Israelis now believe that the entire Palestinian community is in danger of being overtaken by what amounts to a death wish.
And the shaheeds, the martyrs, namely the bombers, become the heroes of society, the role models. They are the ones that show the society the lead. They show the ideals, the values. They are the example that to be followed.
Moderate Palestinians firmly deny their young people are rushing to become suicide bombers because they love death more than life.
This is not part of our culture, or even Islam. There are extremists in all religions. So the very glib argument that these are emerging as the dominant culture in Palestine or the Arab world is not only is it wrong and misleading, but it distracts people from dealing with the real causes.
But the terror and worldwide revulsion caused by repeated suicide bombings has allowed Israel to argue that there is little to distinguish the Palestinians from other Islamic enemies of both Israel and its only major ally, America.
I think that all the Western world should take into consideration that the extreme Islamic groups are all over, and they have to be very careful about it. And all the Western world should think twice, because now it's here and it can be there.
Israel sees itself as a society under siege. Surveillance cameras feed images from the old city of Jerusalem into police headquarters. Since the attack on America on September 11, 2001, the Israeli police have been regularly consulted by their American counterparts.
I think that after September 11th, law enforcement in the United States, police officers wanted to be proactive. And they were smart, and they said, let's go to them who can teach us how we can maybe deal with serving and protecting our people in the States.
Volunteers from the Orthodox Jewish organization Zaka, Hebrew for True Mercy, rush to the scene of every suicide bombing to help the wounded and tend to the dead. The Jewish faith requires that every part of a person's body and blood be collected for burial. At the end of 2002, Zaka opened their first overseas branch in New York City.
I can tell you that for the Palestinians and for the extreme Islamic groups in the world, including the Hamas and the Jihad, the big Satan is the United States. Israel is only the small Satan.
The risk of terror attacks on American streets may increase as America increases the pressure to kick Saddam Hussein out of Iraq. And any Muslim terrorist wanting to strike at the heart of America cannot fail to have taken note of the deadly impact of suicide bombing attacks on Israel.
And this is the same kind of suicide bombers that attacking the bus here or the airplane in New York and the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. And if we are not going to be united, all the Western world, all the civilization in the world, against this extreme Islamic terrorist, I don't know whether we are not going to suffer once again.
Mainstream Palestinian politicians flatly deny any link with Iraq or Islamic extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and say there is no chance of Palestinian suicide bombers targeting America.
So I think it would be very far-fetched in any way to look at Palestinians or Palestinian even suicide bombers as having any reach or any intentions to reach the US. This is not a global phenomenon. This is a localized struggle.
Palestinian suicide bombers know that their families may receive large sums of money from Saddam Hussein as a reward for their slaughter of Israelis. The more Jews are killed, the larger the payment made.
These individuals can achieve something in death, a notoriety or fame, the financial comfort, for example, of their families, veneration of their families in a community. In other words, their families go from being nothings, ordinary citizens, to the most respected members of a community in death that they can achieve in life.
Israeli politicians are anxious to be seen standing shoulder to shoulder with their American ally against the Islamic extremists.
The reason is that this philosophy of the extreme Islamic groups is to kill and to murder civilians, everyone that they can.
Moderate Palestinians, while condemning the use of suicide bombs against Israeli civilians, argue that it's the Israeli military overkill that creates the threat of further suicidal attacks.
The Israelis this way distance themselves from the consequences of their own actions. They're the ones who are helping manufacture suicide bombers. They're the ones who have to look at what they're doing. Because it seems to me killing innocents of the other side by using military means and so on is no less wicked or evil.
18 months after the worst ever suicide attack on America, experts are worried that we still don't understand the real nature of the terrorist threat.
I think one of the more significant developments we've seen in recent years is that these terrorist groups want to operate on multiple levels. On the top, let's say, their most professional cadre, they engage in spectacular, well-planned, well-financed attacks such as those of September 11th on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon.
The next attack may come not from a sophisticated terrorist conspiracy, but instead from low-level fanatics responding to anti-American propaganda.
What they're deliberately attempting to do is motivate, animate, activate individuals to take matters into their own hands, to essentially do the bidding of the organization, even if they're not a member of that organization themselves. A terrorist could focus on landmarks, any place where there's a large congregation of people, where there's a public gathering spot.
The suicide bomber's favorite target in Israel is a bus, crowded with unwitting commuters. But in New York and every other American city, there is little to prevent a terrorist boarding a crowded bus or subway. Despite the election at the end of January 2003, there is little likelihood of the Israeli government changing its approach to dealing with the Palestinian revolt, and little chance that the Palestinians will abandon their most effective weapon in their war with the Israelis.
And the only question is how many people will die, and after peace will prevail. I'm sure that peace will prevail in time. The only ones who will keep on crying is the bereaved families, for now.
Remy Elhanan, who lost a daughter to suicide bombers, believes that eventually both Israelis and Palestinians will realize that they have to talk, not fight.
After the night comes the day, after the dark comes the light. And in the end, people will come to their senses. People will understand that the price of not having peace is too high.
Many young Palestinians are growing up convinced that suicide bombs are both necessary and justifiable to wake the world up to the plight of the Palestinian people. Nida Tawil's 19-year-old brother blew himself up in March 2001.
I feel so bad for the September 11th bombings, but unfortunately, it was the only way to get everybody's attention. And now they wanted to know more about Islam, they wanted to know more about Palestine and more about Arabs. I think it's a shame not to know about anybody until they kill you. That's so bad.
So is it only a matter of time before we see suicide bombers on the streets of New York?
I don't say it's inevitable. I don't say it's inevitable. I came to fear that it would happen simply because it just seemed to be moving like wildfire here, and in the course of the war that the Bush administration has declared on terrorism. After the 9/11 attacks, it didn't seem like terrorists would feel they would need to do something quite so spectacular again to sow fear.
So long as America remains Israel's closest friend and is viewed as the great Satan by Muslim extremists, the fear exists that the extremists' most frightening weapon may yet appear on American streets.